much about creating different kinds of scope. Okay, so scope. So if you think about the way a company works, right? In a company, not everyone has access to all the information, if you will. If you're the CEO of a company, you might have the right to say, hey, I want to know everything, and no one's going to tell you no, right? But if you were to, if you're working at a company and you're, let's say, a junior employee, and you go to the CEO and say, hey, I want to know all the company's past financial records. Someone might say, well, that's not really, that's private, right? And you don't need it for your job. So therefore, you don't really need to know it, period. In computers, that's what scope essentially does, is scope really limits what variables and what functions someone may or may not have access to. Why do you think it's really important that scope exists, and besides just kind of flooding everything with information? Yeah. Okay, so you basically have a lot of variables, and you need to keep track of them all at the same time.
Yeah, you can never assign.
Yep. Anything else? One other reason is that it's actually very similar to the CO example I just gave, right? It's for security reasons. You don't want everything that's programmed to have access to everything all at once, especially in cases where you may have a third party accessing this code, right? So, for example, if I was to log into Chase.com, right? Chase wants to be very, very clear that what I have access to is scoped out very cleanly to my account, right? I shouldn't be able to log into anyone else's account and access all that information. That's an example of scope, and it's something that exists in programming to the utmost degree as well, because it is something that makes sure that we can keep a very clear separation of, hey, this is what you need to know to do your job, and we don't really want you to know any more than that. Okay, so whenever we create, so the way that we think about scope is there's two types of scope. One's called global scope, and then one's called local scope. By default, when we open up a page, that's the global scope. As in, if we do var in there, anything else, so var is when we create a variable. Var is how we kind of tell everyone else, hey, who actually has access to this variable? And the quick answer is everyone who is in that scope or within that scope has access to it. So it's probably not something that's easy to describe verbally, but let's take a look at this example here. Okay. So here we have this function called add5. In it, we declare this this variable called num equals 5, and then we return n plus num. Does this work?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I can type it out for you, but the answer is yes, it does work, right? And the reason why is because, well, we have a variable n that comes from here, right? It's a parameter. We have a num that's here that we just created. So why wouldn't I be able to add them together, assuming they're both numbers, or even strings for that matter? Does this work?
No. Yeah, it does.
Does it?
Mm-hmm.
If I wait long enough, I feel like you guys can we'll just oscillate back and forth. Okay. Okay. So this one I'll just type out for us, because it sounds like there's a little bit of disagreement here, right? So the root of it was var num equals 5. We have this function, and we call it add5. I think it was n. It was n plus num. Okay, so n plus num, or no, n comma num are the parameters, and then we have return, yep, n plus num, and then here we have a console log. Oh, I should have just left it in the function. Well, add5, and then what was the arguments? Or the add5 3 num. Okay, or whatever. Right? Cool. Okay, so I run that, and I get 8. Why does that work? Or rather, some folks said no.
I said no before I saw the parameter.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Okay, so well, that's a really good question. So you're saying if I take this out, then it won't work anymore.
Yeah.
Okay. Still works. Why?
Because you have access to the variable. It's the global scope.
It's stated before you write your
Yep. So coming back to let me zoom this in now. So come back to this example here, right? What we're really saying here is, hey, look, we have this var called num, right? And just if we suspend our disbelief here and assume that this is the entire piece of code, I know it starts on line 9, so let's assume there's no lines 1 through 8. What scope is num on?
Local.
It's a global scope, right? Right. There's no set of curly braces there, and it is at the absolute highest level, so to speak, right? It is in like the root or the parent or the global scope, or whatever you call it, right? So what does that mean? That means everything else on this page is going to have access to num, right? So that's why if I remove this parameter num, this function still works. Now, what does it mean then when I create another parameter called num?
What do you mean?
Well, okay, so then so let's use this example here now. So this is what we have before, right? We have a num parameter here, and if I add a console.log here of num, right now num is 5, right? Everyone knows that. That makes sense. What if I change this to like a 4? What is num now?
4.
Why?
I think the local scope overrides it.
Right, because what's really happening is remember what we said yesterday? What happens when you create a parameter? JavaScript is more or less in the background creating a new variable like that. Remember, like in the parameter, we create a variable, and so now the really interesting thing here is, okay, we have another variable called num, right? And we're assigning it to whatever value we pass in. In this case, it's 4. So in this program, there are now 2 copies of num, right? There are 2 variables called num. How does add5 know which one to use? Scope. Yeah. So the way that JavaScript looks, so JavaScript is, I guess, we can think about it as like a, it looks for scope, let's say, from a bottoms up, inside out approach. Okay. So what I mean by that is if you're accessing a variable, the way JavaScript looks for that value is first it will try to look in its own scope, right? Like the scope of the function that you're in. Okay. And in that scope, it will say, okay. And the reason why I say it looks from bottom up is if I now have another variable here called var num equals 8, it will actually try to look up from where it's at. It will try to look up and see the most recent variable, right? So now theoretically, I kind of have 3 variables called num, right? And the way it looks is like, okay, let's look at my local scope. Are there things called num? Oh, there are 2. Okay, let me get the most recent one, which in JavaScript, as you think about it, code executes from top down. It will be the one that's like closest to the bottom, if you will. Does that kind of make sense to folks? Okay, so let's get rid of that so it does become less confusing. So now, when we go back to this world, so now when we go back to this world now, this num is actually being created, and in this case, what in line 5 or 6, really, right? We're saying, hey, can you do something with this num variable? It'll say, okay, do I have it in my local scope? And if there's, oh yeah, I have a copy, I have 1 copy. Great, let's just use that, right? It doesn't have to go out to the parent scope, to the global scope to look at it. And this is how JavaScript works, right? Like, no matter how many layers of nesting of scopes you have, it will always look for the closest one first. Because in the JavaScript, the idea is the one that's most recently defined is the one that applies best to me. Yeah. Jason?
So is scope in a way kind of relative concept?
Relative what?
Concept, meaning,
yep. So
a local scope for one nested thing can be a global scope for another one. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. So in that case, we wouldn't call it a global scope. We would call it a parent scope. Because it's like a child in computer, like child and parent is like kind of what should be used for inheritance. So in this case, we would say, oh, this local scope is like the child scope, and you can look at your parent scope, right? Global scope, there's only ever one global scope ever, and it is the root. Like it is a root. scope. So there's not like you can have multiple local scopes. You can have multiple child scopes or multiple parent scopes. You can only ever have one global scope, and that's why it's called global, right? And it's the reason why we'll cover this in a later slide, but it's the reason why you actually want to use a global scope as little as possible in most cases. So I guess now we kind of understand why this works, and we also understand why something like this also works too, right? Like num's not a parameter anymore, but now we're looking at 5. Do you have a num? No, we don't. Let's look in our parent scope, which, in this case, it happens to be the global scope. Is there a num variable? Yes, there is. Great, let's use that value. It's the next best thing that we have. Okay, so what about this here then?
Won't work.
Why not?
Because num is in the scope of another function.
Okay. It's also not global. It's in another function. Okay. There's actually another reason why this would, like looking at this, there should be a very clear reason why this doesn't work. This like jumps out immediately. Jason?
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, reason.
There's nothing in the first parentheticals
For create num.
yeah.
Okay. I mean, there doesn't have to be though, right? Like we're defining a new variable and adding a default. Kelly?
The num isn't in the second function, or the variable isn't defined in the second function.
Yeah. So that's kind of like the idea that like it's in the wrong scope. Okay. The reason why I looked at this and my first thought was, well, there's clearly this not work is because, in line 31 we create this function called add 5, right? And we use it on line 35. On line 27 we create this function called create num. Where do we ever actually invoke that function? Right? We define this function that creates this really magical variable, which is great, but no one ever calls it, right? So it's almost like a comment at this point, like, oh hey, it's here, but we never use it. So I know right away that no matter which scope I'm in, really, num is never being created, ever. Yeah.
Would that function even do anything because there's no?
Right.
Well, so that's a good question. So let's just solve it with code. So let's see this function. So this is called create num. We don't pass it anything, and then we do something called var num equals 5, right? So okay. So I think this is how it looked, right? Get rid of this console log. Okay. Well, I mean, this obviously fails because we never invoke create num, right? So what you're saying is, hey, if we actually invoke create num, and then we do add 5, does this work now? Right? That's kind of the question. Like, okay, so you guys all understand if we don't invoke a function, then nothing's going to happen with it. It doesn't run automatically. Great. We're past that. We actually run it now on line 10. We actually run create num. What do you think is going to happen on line 7 when we actually get there in the add 5 function? Or I'm sorry?
I think it'll work.
Think it'll work?
Yeah, because you're calling the function, and it's creating a return, and you can use that value if it's in a return.
Okay. So, yep. So remember how I said scopes can look inside out, right? When add 5 starts running, right? It first looks in which scope?
What's the question?
So in line 7 like return n plus num, right? N comes from the parameter, like we're clear on that. Where is it looking for num?
The global scope.
No, where is it looking for num first?
Love.
Right. It's looking at in between these curly brackets.
Right.
I guess I can't highlight it, but you guys can see the gist of it, right? It's looking at where it was this color braces and saying, okay, clearly there's no num here. Great. Where does it look next?
Global scope.
Global scope. Okay. And what is a global scope?
Outside of any curly brackets.
Okay. Well, is a num part of the global scope then?
No.
Why not?
local scope of the other function.
And so here's another reason why indentation is also super important, is because indentation makes it very clear which scopes are parent scopes, right? Which scopes are scopes in which you have access to, and which ones are parallel to you, or even within you, right? And so the way that scope then works, as you can see here, is scope will look in itself, it can look in its parent scope, but it can't look inside any other scopes, right? So you can't look in the scopes of anything parallel with you. And in this case, we know that these two scopes are quote unquote parallel or siblings because they're indented at the same level, which visually makes it really clear, but they're also kind of one curly brace deep in from the global scope, right? And the crazy thing here is that if I wanted to just do this, so I know that I can't look in my sibling scope, but what if I do something like this now? I move this inside here. And then I'll actually run this, so I know that at some point that function is running. Would this work now?
No.
It shouldn't.
Yeah, no problem.
If I just stay quiet long enough, they're going to converge at some point. Okay. It won't work, right? Because remember, it looks in its own scope first, right? This is not its own scope, right? This is its own scope, right? This is like a child scope, or this is we call it children's scope, right? But it's like this is a scope something deeper, right? So this once again harkens back to this idea that scope looks outwards. It can't look inside anything else. It can only look outwards. Okay. So when we have a child scope here, then. So when we create a scope here, we create bar num. That's great. The really awesome thing is like if we were to say if we were to console log out num or n here, would this work?
Yes. Yes. I think so.
Anyone say no?
Wait, like with the function?
Would this line 7 would that console log out n, or to give me a n is not defined error?
No. Won't be the same. No.
I don't know if people are talking to me or just like muttering under their breath for themselves right now. But I mean, I'll just do it, right? That worked, right? Because if I'm creating now, what scope am I looking for things in? What's the first scope that I look for?
Within its bracket.
Which lines?
7 and 8.
Yeah, 6, 7, and 8, and 9. Yeah, so basically this part here, right? Okay, is there a variable called n in there?
No.
Okay, so what's the next scope I'm looking for?
The next one.
Give me line numbers for where that scope started with.
Well,
Great. So there's nothing inside here called n. I now look in here, right? Lines 4 through 13. Is there a variable called n in there? There is, right? Because we create it in the parameters. What if in that case, and I don't even get that far, and I have something called var n equals 6 or equals 5 here? Would this work now?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, ignore this error, but the 5 prints out, right? And it works because if it's here on line 7 now, I'm looking for 6 and 9 first, so not finding anything called n. Okay, great. Let me zoom out a little bit. Now I'm looking at lines 4 through 13, and there's something called global scope. Or sorry, there's something called n. There's not. So then I go out one more level. I'm like, okay, now I'm in the global scope. This is the parent scope. Is there anything here? And in this case, we say, oh, there's something here. Great. It's several scopes removed from me, but it's like the next best option that I have, right? And so n does exist. And obviously, if we delete it here, we're gonna get an n is not defined error because now it's gonna go all the way to the global scope. Say, is there an n? There's no n. It's like, okay, then I'm gonna assume this variable does not exist anywhere, and you made an error somehow. Jason.
So a child, if I'm using it right, a child function will look within itself and its parent.
Yeah.
But the parent will only look within itself and not
And its parents.
and it.
Right. So you can't see inside someone else's scope, right? So that's what I say. Scope only looks outwards, right? So theoretically, the deeper nested you are, the more variables you have access to. You have access to all of your variables plus your parents. But your parents can't look into your child scope, and you also can't look into your sibling scopes as well. Yeah.
If you define n below create num, it wouldn't work though, right?
If I define n below create num, that's a good question.
Should.
It,
It's getting past that, right?
it might. That's why. That's why.
I'm fine.
Okay, yeah. So table that thought we're going to cover in the last slide. It works, but not in the way that we think because of how JavaScript is implemented. So for now, let's just like not think about that in the very near term. But at least I guess does everyone have a good grasp now of kind of like when we say scope, like which scope is something is a function looking at. Okay, cool. All right, so yeah. So I mean, this is just a rehash of what we talked about, right? Yeah. So this is just a rehash of what we just talked about. On the left hand side, num doesn't work because even though we create num, which scope is line 46 looking at?
Global.
Right. Line 46 is console log is executing a global scope, right? So it only has one scope, the global scope to look on. And guess what? Num is not in there because num is in create num. It's like child scope, right? So we can't see it. So that's why we get this undefined error. On the right hand side, this is interesting, right? So here's a great example of when we would use return over console log, right? We're saying, hey, prenum, and give me back a number, right? And I'll store it as this num value, right? And then this num value is now being created here. So when we log it out, it obviously logs out very cleanly. What will happen if I had this be a console log 5? What would this line give me then?
Num is undefined.
Right. So what line 55 that will give me is it will actually say like the string num colon space undefined. Right? Because if this is going to console log out 5, what is it returning then?
Nothing.
It's returning undefined. Right? So then what does num become? Right? And so that would be translated here, right? So like I saying in English is gonna be really weird, right? But it's like like num is not undefined. It is defined, and it is the value of undefined, which is the primitive type of JavaScript. Right. So this is like so this is a case in which like we actually need the output of this to do something, and that's where console log is more or less useless to us. We actually need to return and actually pass values back and forth. Cool. All right. So yeah, I mean this I think we've belabored this point a little bit already, but scopes always look out to your parents, but you cannot look at any sibling or any child scopes. So it is like a one-way glass in that regard. And functions are good ways to create scopes. We also use curly braces for if statements, right? While loops, for loops, etc. And those also create scopes. But in ES5, those scopes they're not really respected in the same way that a function scope is. So for now, just kind of in JavaScript ES5, just kind of take it for granted in the near term that function curly braces are the only things that create scopes. Okay, not the best answer I can give you, but just go with that for now. Function curly braces are the only curly braces that create scopes for now. Okay. Okay, global scope. Chrome has a global scope, right? Chrome renders JavaScript, and so every tab you open there has a global scope. And honestly, like you can put whatever you want on the global scope. And then this line, the bullet 4 here, is something that's very, very important to know too, right? When we say var, when we create a variable, we always say var x, var foo, var num equals whatever, right? You don't have to actually use the word var. And when you don't, what happens is that like JavaScript looks at and just assumes, oh, you meant to put this variable on a global scope, right? Because remember, var creates variables within its scope, right? So when you don't have var, JavaScript is going to think, oh, that means you want to put it on the highest scope possible so that everyone else here can have access to that variable if they need it. But global scopes are incredibly dangerous because one, there's zero privacy. Literally by definition, anyone else on that page has access to that variable. Two is when you create a global scope, you actually sometimes don't exactly realize if you're overriding anything or if you're duplicating some other functionality. And really, in general, the good rule of thumb is you should never have variables on the global scope or minimize it to the utmost degree possible. If you go, yeah, I mean, like, this is one of the things that I guess like you just kind of pick up as you do this more and more is that global scopes are just really, really dangerous. And like, there are very, very few things that even conceptually you would think everything on a page needs access to, right? In most cases, functions in JavaScript are meant to do one very specific thing, right? It's a very modular system, right? Hey, I need a function that gives me back a date from a string to a number, or that gives me a sum, right? And so every function should theoretically do one job and do it very, very well. And so because of that, there's very few things that, every function should have access to. I mean, there's exceptions to every rule, but for now, just take it as kind of gospel that you want to minimize whatever you have on the global scope. So that's an example where you're creating a variable, it goes on the global scope, that code runs perfectly fine, it works, JavaScript recognizes it, but the variable that you create is actually on the global scope, so not great. Yeah, and I mean this is an example. You can check it out. You can check it out in your notes later. But here's an example in which you would actually be overriding a variable with a global scope. Right. Yep. Okay, and then this is just they call it shadowing. They call it shadowing, but it's just a concept I was talking about earlier, where what was it? If you're in the inner function, you do have access to this variable called favor, right? Because it's in your current scope. So if you ever when you, and this is actually pretty much informs how a lot of programmers write functions too. Is that you write it kind of from the outside in, if you will, right? Like you have a function like, I need to do 5 different things. Okay, let me lay out 5 different functions, right? Within each function, what do I need this to do? I need this to do 2 different things, right? And so you lay out 2 functions within it. And so when you write code, most often you're also writing in a very kind of outside in, right? You're going from a very vague, ambiguous scope to something more and more explicit until you get to like the raw numbers or the raw calculations that you need to be doing. And then finally, just parameters are variables, right? Just remember that comment I put in there, like after every declaration function, we're doing var parameter equals this, var parameter equals this, var parameter equals this. So if you're in the child scope, you do have access to your parent's parameters as well. And then lastly is something called hoisting. And hoisting is, I guess, getting back to earlier of why when we declare var num after create num, we got back not an error, but an undefined. So let's see. Okay, this example actually isn't that useful. I'll just go to this page here. Okay, so there's the way that people read JavaScript, and there's the way that computers read JavaScript, right? And so when the way a computer actually reads JavaScript, the way that the JavaScript spec, I guess, is written in a way that like a computer doesn't just read starting from line 1 of JavaScript and then just kind of works its way down the row, right? If it did, then the example we gave earlier where we're defining a num after we call it, it would give an error, right? Like, I'm on line 17 and you create a variable on line 18. So it hasn't created, so therefore it must be wrong. Instead, what JavaScript does, and it's actually very like helpful in a lot of cases, is because if it did read sequentially, then when you write a piece of code, you basically need to be very, very explicit, right, about what you're laying out at every single stage, right? And you would need the code to more or less run in that order. Instead, what JavaScript does is it actually does 2 passes on the code that you write. In the first pass, all it does is looks for basically variable names, right? And what it does is, you remember how yesterday when we were talking about the undefined primitive type, right? The point of the undefined type is that, like, if I do var x, just var x, like, well, not here, but like, if I just do var x, what is x equal to by default? Undefined, or something. That's very, very likely, but it's basically, if I just do var x, x is undefined, right? And so that's actually what JavaScript does the first time it goes through your code. If you have like 10 functions and 20 variables, it would just say, hey, var x or var a, undefined. Var B, undefined. Var C, undefined, right? So that's the first pass. It actually creates all these variables for you. And then the second time it goes through it, it will then start looking through it and start executing your code, right? It'll say, oh, var A equals 7, var B equals A plus B, right? Or like var C equals A plus B, var function this does this or whatever, right? And but with the reason why like that's really good is because the first time it goes through it, right? Even if a value is undefined, you're not going to get errors because JavaScript says, okay, down the road, this code's going to actually give it real values. For now, I just need to know that it actually exists and that I'm not going to build my code on top of something that doesn't exist. So that's this idea of hoisting, right? So hoisting means to lift up. And so when JavaScript does the first pass in your code, what it's doing is that it's actually finding all the variables and functions and it's lifting it up so that it can be used. And then when it goes through the code, it'll actually start executing it against it, right? And in this, and at that phase, even if you have a value that's not defined yet, what it'll do is well, actually this right hand side, right? So this is kind of what we did that we had earlier. It's like, hey, look, I'm trying to console log a variable called x that I don't define until 2 lines later. If I was a JavaScript engine, the way I would interpret this code is, okay, first step, let's go through it. Okay, line 86 or lines, we'll say 1, 2, and 3, right? Lines 1 and 2, nothing happens. Line 3, okay, var x. That's it, just var x. Okay. So and then on the second pass, I'll go through it. I'll go through line 1. Says, okay, console.log x. Well, what is x at this point? Undefined, right? Because on the first pass, all I did was say var x. That was it, right? And then, so that's why when I log this out, it'll log out to me, undefined. And then when I get to line 3, I'll actually assign it the value of 3. Okay? So hoisting, basically, it's a way to make sure that your code is written in a way that you don't, as a human, you don't need to be very, very explicitly careful about in what order you do things at. But you kind of still do because you're trying to do some calculations. In general, as a good rule of thumb, any variables that you like use or are trying to do things with, you should have already defined it before it. But JavaScript at least makes sure that you don't error out if you don't do it in the right order. So that's just where hoisting comes in. And then the last part of hoisting is yesterday, I kind of glossed over this idea of, oh, hey, do I want to declare a function expressively versus no, sorry, do I want to do it expressly versus declaratively? Declarations versus expressions. In the example on the left, that's the declaration. You can actually call a function before you define it, and the reason why is because on the first pass, JavaScript is going to say, oh hey, this say hi function, it's this thing, right? And on the second pass, when it actually goes through and tries to execute the code, it'll say, oh hey, you want to execute something? Well, good thing I already hoisted up for you, so you can access it, quote unquote, before you define it, or at least look at it sequentially, right? In this case, you're going to get an error because the first thing that it's going to do is going to say, oh hey, the first pass it'll say, oh say hi equals what? Undefined, right? It's just creating a placeholder value variable called say hi, right? So that's why when you try to do on the second pass, we'll try to execute say hi will be undefined, and so the error that you get is, I mean, you guys, I'm not sure you can see it very clearly, but you're not getting a hey, say hi doesn't exist error. What you're getting is a say hi is not a function error, right? Because JavaScript says, oh, okay, so you have a say hi variable, great, so far that checks out, and you have an open and closed parentheses, which means you're trying to invoke it, which means I'm going to go on a limb and say you think you're a function, or you think this is a function, and try to invoke it, and JavaScript says, well, undefined can be invoked, and so that's how you get this error saying say hi is not a function. It will become a function later on, but it won't be. And so for this reason, my personal preference is to use function declarations. I like it a lot more because you just kind of don't worry as much about like the order in which things happen. There are like very few edge cases for why this is sometimes better, but honestly, it's probably more trouble than it's worth around to memorize those edge cases. But essentially, this is why like this paradigm exists, is because it may look the same, and if your code is written in the right order or in a order, it will function the exact same. But there are cases in which they operate differently. Andy, or do you have a question? Or okay, cool. Okay, so any questions before we just go into like the review or the workshop so far?
I'm just confused. So on the last slide.
Yeah.
So the function, it would post up like the value of the say height or whatever the say height function to call it. So it would work.
Yeah. So
But
let's say I do the first pass, right?
yeah.
So there's two passes, right? Let's say I'm just focusing on the first pass.
You actually writing it twice or just the computer writing?
The computer scans the code twice. The first time it does something, second time it does something else, right?
Okay.
So let's just focus on the first pass right now, right? On the left hand side, on the first pass, it says, oh, you have to say hi as a function, and the console logs out hi to me. Okay. On the right hand side, on the first pass, it will say, oh great, you have this variable called say hi. I'll say it's undefined for now. Right? So like the first pass, like JavaScript looks at both of these code and does something very different, right? The first one, the first pass, there's already a function with like execution steps behind, right? On the right hand side, it's just a defined variable. This could be a number, this could be anything, it doesn't have to be a function, right? On the second pass, on line 1, on the right hand, on the left hand side, they'll try to execute it. It'll be, oh, well that makes sense because you're a function, you want to run. Great, go run. On the right hand side, it'll say undefined. Let me try to run a function. Oh, I can't because it's undefined, it's not a function.
So then for the previous example with like console log x.
Yeah.
Why that would come out undefined? Right? Is that
Yeah, so this
why
size.
why isn't it like why isn't it able to take like the value of the variable? Does that make sense? Like for the function, you can write it and then it'll find the function.
Yeah. Think of it this way. In the first pass of the JavaScript thing, it will only look at what's ever on the left-hand side of an equal sign. Right? So in this case, on the first pass, it won't even see this equals to. It will just say var x.
Oh, okay.
Right? And on the second pass, it will try to do something with that var x.
Without going down.
Without going down, right?
Okay.
So on this example, like there's no equal sign, right? So you can, because everything will like, oh, it'll just see this whole thing because it's like a function, right? Functions are implemented kind of uniquely in JavaScript. Like we don't need to necessarily go into that level of depth on it, but just know that like on this left-hand side, on the first pass, JavaScript sees an equal sign, so it just kind of reads the whole thing more or less.
All of it.
Right. And then on this example, it sees only the left-hand side, which is just var say hi. It doesn't care about anything else.
So that's why it's undefined.
Right, and yeah, and so I mean, like, yeah, I mean, I don't need to belabor the point, right? But when you say var say hi, JavaScript assumes it's undefined until you tell it something else.
But it doesn't get that far.
Right, and on the second time we actually go through the code, right. So on the second time we go through the code, the first time it tries to execute it, usually it fails here. But let's say it didn't fail, then by line like 3 or 5, it would actually get to the point where it's saying, oh, you're a function, great. So if we have moved say hi from here to here. First pass, it would still say hi as an undefined variable. Second pass, it would say, oh, you're actually a function. And then afterwards, it tries to execute it, say, okay, great, you're a function. This worked out. Okay. I mean, nothing here should be, nothing here should be new, hopefully. But yeah, just ignore this ES6 kind of caveats because scopes are kind of a science in itself. There's always more levels of depth to go into it, but I think for now we have enough that we can kind of do a decent amount of even advanced JavaScript without letting it be like a huge hindrance in our thinking of how that works. Keep in mind that things with variables, we decline var, that is available for it and also for all of its child scopes. Parameters are the same thing. They are just like vars. Like you can almost imagine there's a default var x or var parameter equals value being passed in. And scopes only look outwards, not sideways, and not inwards. So, any questions? Okay. I will slack out pairs. Feel free to take a break if you want, and we come back. Or if you choose to just hang out here and start working, feel free to get started.